power, right? And sort of this very cursory, this is how you go about attaining power, and this person has a theme on how to get power. Nobody does it better than Nietzsche, right? The whole point, the origin, the foundation, block one, day one of my attempt to attain power is to recognize that we're not talking about legal codes, right? You need to function within sort of legal code, right? Or else they'll lock you up. But insofar as you recognize that there are value systems that are set in place in order to govern and control your behavior, for example, thou shalt not commit adultery. Someone asks, hypothetically speaking, someone says, hey, have you committed an act of adultery? I immediately tell them your question is loaded. Your question has absolutely no meaning for me, because your question, insofar as you evoke the notion of adultery, is inherently pejorative. Your question is already loaded. Absolutely not. Have you had intercourse outside of wedlock? Well, yeah, I have. Oh my God. I can't, this is not me, this is an example. You got to assume the character of Nietzsche, right? And of Nietzsche's text, not even as Nietzsche as a man, but why am I going to let that system's value inform who I am? I'm not breaking any laws, right? I'm not going to allow you to control the way that I function in this world, right? And insofar as you're governed by those rules and I'm not governed by those rules, then the guilt and the judgments that follow from you violating those commandments, I do not feel. I don't feel that guilt. While you're at home remorsing, I'm out in the world being productive. So, the argument, and I'm trying to keep it ghetto, but you can see that this is very deep. The argument is that I arrive at a higher degree of power because I recognize the falsity in these oppositions, right? So, uber powerful, right? Uber powerful stuff. Number two, considering the damage all human institutions sustained if the divine and transcendent higher sphere is postulated that must first sanction these institutions, right? This is 245. This is actually a really good note. I'm going to read the whole thing. He says, consider the damage all human institutions sustain if a divine and transcendent higher sphere is postulated that must first sanction these institutions. So, think about all the damages that's going to happen to human institutions if, in order to attain their legitimacy, they need to evoke the divine. So how does that, this point's a little bit more difficult. So we'll talk about human institutions, right? Think about an office building, if you will. Right? So think about human institutions, right? If the institution itself requires or makes an appeal to the divine, and it is the divine that then grants legitimacy to the institution, well, we can see immediately how the institution can be co-opted by the divine. And he talks about this explicitly at length with respect to the sacerdotal class, right? He says that the institution of religion obviously appeals to the divine, and the divine grants it legitimacy. But in the Dark Age, and even before that, really what you ended up having was a sacerdotal class that was almost primarily the only educated population really on the globe, right? You had priests and you had members of clergy who had high degrees, insanely high degrees of education, usually spoke whatever their native languages were. It could have been German, could have been whatever, including probably Latin and ancient Greek, and they had the religious texts, and this is where Anselm and St. Thomas Aquinas and others flourish, right? The idea that Christianity and philosophy are in some sense waging a battle historically is true, but there really is no philosophy without Christianity. That's a categorical fact, right? Philosophy proper develops out of the theological tradition, right? It develops out of, or through, I shouldn't say out of per se, because obviously this comes prior. The ancients come prior to Christ. But really and truly the influence, the way of reasoning develops through and with sort of Christian theological discourse. It's only in a contemporary setting that there is no theological response, and this is evident from, I guess, the fact that I didn't get a response. There really hasn't been. I don't really know of many. I mean, I do, but I don't know of many significant or a tradition of theoretical, philosophical, Christian-based responses to some of these critiques. And the point is, well, if we are appealing to the divine to attain legitimacy, now our educational system becomes indoctrinated. Our scientific institutions become indoctrinated. Our social institutions become indoctrinated to the divine, right? Get rid of the divine, right? And recognize that we are attempting to appeal to reality, right? Right? Appeal to the biological, right? Appeal to the biological and have the biological inform the institutions, right? That's what we should be doing. This is what philosophy in a contemporary setting is doing. This is what physics does. This is what social sciences do, and so on. So I think that's a very good. I think that's a very good point. 2A, power is limited by the sanctioning of, right? This idea that in order to attain legitimacy, it has to be sanctioned by the divine is a good point. Number 3, knowledge and wisdom in themselves have no value. That's a great line, right? Knowledge and wisdom in themselves have no value. And the point to Nietzsche is to say, if we're talking about, and I'll erase this, if we're talking about knowledge, right? If we're talking about knowledge for the sake of knowledge, right? There really isn't any value to this. And for a deeper discussion on sort of the relevancy of this, you can watch my video, David Hume's Fork and Immanuel Kant's Synthetic a priori. And basically what ends up happening is if we have a tautological statement, just quick, right? A equals A. The fact that A equals A is true, but the fact that A equals A is not only true, David Hume says it's meaningless. Yeah, it's true, but you're not telling me anything, right? You're saying a book is a book. Great. You know, I have gained some knowledge. That knowledge is of the world. That knowledge can be verified if you're into verification, and so on and so on. But inherently, the knowledge is meaningless, right? I can say, more specifically, not choosing an a posteriori claim, choosing a priori claim, a bachelor is an unmarried man. By definition, this is true. However, I haven't gained any meaning in the world. So knowledge for its own sake isn't really the point. There is no value. Knowledge is a means, right, of attaining what? Some semblance. I wouldn't go so far because I don't believe in I don't believe in a whole truth. I don't believe in truth as sort of definitive truth as such. I've read too much Nietzsche, right? This idea of truth as such, and I'm giving it away. I didn't want to say it, but since I'm here now, the idea of truth as such, in opposition to falsity as such, preserves this binary opposition, right? Truth as opposed to falsity. And we recognize now mathematically that this is false, fuzzy logic. And I've had a ton of requests to do fuzzy logic on my YouTube channel. But some of the things I'm going to encourage you guys to do on your own. It's just too complicated to sort of flesh out. It's not really too complicated, but I mean the instruction of it requires a lot more interaction, and the technology just doesn't allow me to get feedback from you guys in the way that I would need to give a lecture like that. But the idea is, in fuzzy logic, and this is what's used, I don't do computer science at all. I don't know computer science, but computer science borrows from the logic. I do know the logic. The logic states that in attempt to make varying degrees of choices within the day, us as biological organisms recognize there's a certain degree of truth and falsity to assumptions that we make. We don't, for most things, say that this is just the case A, this is just the case B. We recognize that there's some fluidity, and in the fraction of milliseconds, we make judgments based on varying degrees of truth. This idea is the idea based in fuzzy logic, and it's built on the assumption that sort of the binary opposition between truth and falsity isn't, you know, which legitimizes predicate and symbolic logic, isn't going to function for this new theory, symbolic, fuzzy logic. So, you know, I told you we would get a little deeper, but you can see how we arrive at that level of complexity. All right. So, next point. So we're going to begin on page 43, top of 43, and this is, the title is On Christian Altruism and the Conservation of Weakness. Remember we said before that for Nietzsche, the idea within the Christian tradition was to conserve that which is weak, right? And initially you said it didn't seem like it was problematic, but we saw there's two ways of interpreting this, right? The attempt to conserve, within the Christian moral tradition, the attempt to conserve that which is weak is inherently against the process of natural selection, that the principle of selection, I think he calls it, but obviously he's referencing the process of natural selection, and natural selection selects those that are weak. Two ways of interpreting that. One is to say that this process of selection, he means actually the biological destruction of Christians, which I think would be ridiculous. But it is valid based on what he wrote. I think a more charitable interpretation is the destruction of the institution, right? The sense in which, ideologically speaking, I have, because of my sort of deconstruction, delegitimized the institution itself. The highest moral values become devalued, right? I think to be charitable, I think that's also a way of sort of ideological selection, right? And I'm not sure if anyone's actually done that. That would be a pretty interesting analysis. Anyway, so we're going to talk about this idea of conserving the weakness now, right? So this is on Christian altruism and the conservation of the weakness,